Hello, and welcome to Episode 5 of Sorastro's The Lord of the Rings painting series. In this episode we're going to paint the first of the hero figures, Legolas, from Fantasy Flight Games' The Lord of the Rings Journeys in Middle-earth. As there is only one of each hero figure, we can afford to indulge ourselves by spending a fair bit more time bringing each character to life. In choosing colours for Legolas, I've taken inspiration both from the book, in which he is described as a strange elf clad in green and brown, as well as the amazing character art by Magyali Villeneuve. I'll therefore be using quite an autumnal palette of warm greens and browns, although you could of course feel free to interpret your Legolas however you like. Please note that I'll be covering some of the heroes, such as Eleanor, as PDF guides which you can download freely from Sorastro.com. Let's now take a look at a brief summary of how I've chosen to paint Legolas the elf. As usual, I've primed all of my figures in black, followed with some grey and white zenithal highlights applied from above. I'll then be applying the base colours, keeping things a little on the dark side to give me room to play with the highlights later on. We can then apply a couple of shades to bring some depth to the recesses. And I'll then be spending a fair bit of time building up the highlights to add a sense of volume and create a nice warm ambience, before finishing the miniature off with some scenic elements for the base. Let's begin with the base colours. I'm going to begin by painting the skin using flat flesh, which I've darkened with the addition of a little flat brown and some refractive green. This is entirely optional, but I'm now going to mix an off-white to paint in the eyes. I'm doing this now of course, so that if we make a mess of things, it will be easy enough to correct with some of the skin tone. I've now chosen to use some black mixed with a little blue to dot in some pupils. I repeat that this is a very optional touch that really isn't necessary for a decent tabletop standard, but it is quite a nice touch if you're taking close-up images of the models. And I'm now doing some final trimming back with the surrounding skin colour. For the hair, I've mixed just a little purple into some black, and I'm applying this somewhat thinly to allow the texture to show through. Adding a little flow enhancer can also help with this. The purple here is just to add a little interest, and you could equally use something like blue or brown if you like. Next I'm painting the cloak using a roughly 3:2 mix of refractive green and flat brown. I'm applying this in a couple of layers to achieve an opaque finish, as I want full control over the hue and contrast of the highlights I'll be adding in a while. I'm now going to mix some refractive green with a little clear orange in a roughly 4:1 ratio, and I'm using this to paint the braces, tunic and the boots. You could choose to paint the trim on the outfit in a different colour, depending on how busy you'd like the miniature to look. You may also wish to paint the boots in brown instead. I've just chosen to paint them green, as I'd like green to be the dominant colour, taking around 2/3 of the miniature, with brown taking the remaining third, which is a ratio that often makes for quite a pleasing balance of tones. Next I'm going to paint the legs, once again using refractive green, this time mixed with just a little flat blue. This cooler tone will be different enough from the surrounding green to help break things up a bit. For the belt and quiver strap, I'm mixing quite a dark and desaturated brown, using a mix of black and flat brown. For the arms, I'm going to mix quite a vibrant lime green tone by adding some yellow ochre and lemon yellow to some refractive green. Here I'm mixing my two yellow tones, which I'm now adding to the refractive green. The exact ratios aren't that important, but you can see I've gone pretty yellow for this, to differentiate it just enough from the other green tone used for the braces and tunic. I've also chosen to use this for the quiver. For the bow, I've chosen to once again add a little black to some flat brown. I've not gone quite as dark as I did for the belt, however. For the shaft of the arrows, I'm going to lighten some flat brown with some buff and some refractive green. This just gives me quite a neutral mid-tone brown. And for the feathers, I'm desaturating some buff with a little black. For the arrow tip, I'm mixing a little black into some silver. Next I'm painting the decoration on the belt using gold mixed with a little flat brown. I've applied this in a couple of layers and I'm now just tidying the surrounding area. Finally, I'm returning to the silver mix to paint the leaf brooch on the chest, although I chose to do something quite different here later on, so you could leave this for the time being if you like. With the base colours complete, we're ready to add some shade. I'm going to begin by thinning down some Athonian Camoshade with some Larmian medium in a roughly 2:1 ratio, which I'm then going to use to shade all of the green sections of the model. Next I'm going to mix some Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade, which I'm thinning with an equal amount of medium. And I'm using this quite selectively for areas such as the belt and the arrow feathers to create an easy bit of definition. With that done, we're ready to add some highlights and finishing touches. I'm going to begin by highlighting the skin, using the original skin tone mix, but with increasing amounts of flat flesh. You don't have to use these exact tones, of course, and you may well have your own favourite skin tone colours that would also be fine. I would only point out that I've deliberately included a little more green in my base tone than I might usually do, to tie the skin tone with the rest of the model by creating a subtle green cast in the shadows. I'm now continuing to increase the amount of flat flesh. Along the way, I will also be making some small adjustments to the shadow tones if the contrast seems a little harsh. To achieve some even brighter highlights, I'm going to add a little white, and I might also mix in a little red to create some further tonal variation. Some obvious points of highlight include the forehead, cheekbones, and the top of the nose. Here I'm just creating a gentle secondary highlight from below to pick out the jawline. We could also introduce a hint of yellow to these upper highlights. And I'm now adding my final few brightest highlights. Next I'm going to highlight the cloak, which I want to end up with quite a rich orangey colour. I'm therefore going to add increasing quantities of clear orange and buff to the original refractive green and flat brown base tone in several stages. Here I'm adding the buff, and now the orange. This first layer will cover most of the cloak, leaving just the deeper shadows untouched. I'm now lightening the tone and continuing to highlight up, gently increasing the brightness of the most upturned areas. I might occasionally brush a thinned intermediate tone over any obvious transitions, especially for this flat area at the front. I might also run a damp brush along the edge of a highlight to help blend the transition. Here I'm also adding a little flat red. With most of these highlights, I'm aiming to subtly increase the intensity and saturation the further up the miniature we go, helping to lead the eye to the focal point of the figure, which is the face. You can see the area of highlight shrinking the lighter I go. This is my brightest highlight tone. With that done, I'm now going to highlight the braces, tunic and boots by adding increasing quantities of yellow ochre to the original refractive green and clear orange base tone. For these braces, I'm mostly just hitting the raised embellishments. Elsewhere you'll see I'm really just building on the highlights that are already present, and I'll be giving a little more prominence to the trim on the tunic and the boots. I'm now adding some additional yellow ochre in a few stages. When there's not much room to manoeuvre the brush, a small stippling action will usually do. It's often tempting to max the highlights out across the entire miniature, but I'll be reserving my brightest points for the tops of the arms as well as the upper chest area, once again helping to create an overall gradient towards the upper half of the figure. This is my brightest highlight tone. For the more yellowy arms and quiver, I'm now going to simply increase the amounts of yellow ochre and lemon yellow in the original base tone mix. For the bow, I've chosen a slightly desaturated look in the interests of overall balance, so I'm going to be lightening the brown and black base tone with the addition of some buff along with some refractive green. I'm now loosely blocking in where my highlights are going to go, following a basically zenithal approach to help create a sense of volume. Even for the flat vertical surfaces on the sides, I might create some subtle gradients to add interest. I'm working a little quicker here than I did on the cloak, as I don't mind a slightly rougher, more textured look. Although I'm basically working from dark to light, I may still go in with some midtones where necessary. I'm now really pushing the contrast for the most upturned areas, along with some of the edges. This is my brightest tone. Next I'm going to highlight the leather belt and quiver strap by adding some buff and some clear orange to the original black and brown base tone. The main point of interest for me here is the upper half of the strap on the chest. I'm now providing a quick highlight to the arrows by adding some buff to the brown and green base tone. And I'm now using some slightly darkened buff to highlight the feathers with the edges of the brush tip. For the embellishments on the belt, I'm adding just a little flat brown and yellow ochre to some gold. I'm just hitting a few spots to allow the metallic paint to create a few natural reflections as the light hits the model. For the hair, I'm simply adding white to the off-black base tone in a few stages. Here, I mostly like to create small vertical series of highlights on each side of the model to add interest. We can push these highlights quite far to create a glossy look. Here's my brightest tone. And I'm now just doing a little tidying up with the off-black base tone. With the highlights complete, we can hopefully get a sense of a fairly warm, roughly overhead light source, and by pushing the intensity of the light towards the upper half of the model, we've hopefully managed to create a clear focal area for the character. I'm now going to base the figure exactly as detailed in the previous episodes. Alongside some grass tufts, I've chosen to add some flowers. These are from the mixed flower set by Gamer's Grass. Just as with the grass tufts, these can be simply glued down with a little PVA glue. Next, I've chosen to make more of a feature of the leaf brooch we can see on the chest, so I'm first providing a fresh undercoat of pure white. I'm now providing a lemon yellow base tone. Next, I'm using some slightly thinned refractive green to create a gradient. This can be built up in a couple of layers. And I'm finishing the brooch off by adding a little clear orange to the tips of the leaves. And finally, I've chosen to use some neat buff to add a few small final highlights. And this completes Legolas the Elf. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the video. Please note as usual that you'll find a full product list in the video description below, along with links to where I can be reached on a range of social media platforms. My sincerest thanks go to the wonderful patrons who are so kindly funding this series. If you'd like to help support what I do, then feel free to hit the Patreon link to find out more. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from the Lord of the Rings Journeys in Middle-earth. Happy painting!